now adjourn the meeting. And Roy, you want to take over?
Thank you, Ann. We'd like to welcome these special guests we have tonight with us. And I'm just going to go real quickly to introduce everybody to you. We have Kate Waterman, Phyllis Reynolds, Hope Andrews, Ed Sayer, Charlotte Holt, Dick Hutchins, and David Brown. And we'd like to welcome all of you. So why don't we give up a little hand to welcome us. I had this idea about last year that we need to honor some of our older folks in Quonnie and listen, I'm part of you now, so and we thought of this idea of having people just share a favorite memory of Quonnie. And our rule is that we ask people to try to keep it to about 5 minutes or so. And if they go much beyond that, I'm going to have to, just gently come up to you and ask you to pass the mic. So, but they're very good about doing that. You'll probably see behind you a sign. How many of you can guess where that sign used to be? Anybody know? Those of you in the society know about it. Have any of you seen that sign?
Recently?
No, not recently. It goes back a number of years.
Does anybody know where it's, Dick, do you know where that was on Route 1?
Right.
It was on Route 1?
Yeah,
Yes.
Phyllis, do you
right
remember
across
that?
from,
I should, shouldn't I?
just before from Vegetables.
I'm probably the oldest one here. Was it near the borderline of Westerly and Charlestown and Henry Fruit Stand?
No, it's a fruit vegetable stand now where you turn down West Beach Road, wasn't it, right on that corner?
It was on that corner.
meadow,
Okay.
Was
where
it?
the plant, where the garden is. Was that from?
I have no idea where it is.
Well, that's where I remember.
You remember?
Right,
Oh, well, I
turn down
don't
West Beach Road,
remember it.
right on the left.
You mean right by East West Farm?
Right by the
Well, it
farm
would
where
have
they
been,
have
it
the
would-
fruit vegetable.
It predated East West Farm.
It predated East West Farm.
Yeah.
And Route 1 as
Route
we
1, okay.
Yeah.
Before the farm was moved. Okay. Well, we want to thank Bob Frost for letting us borrow the sign, and we're really appreciative of that.
Well, that was before the 4-lane highway was put in, a long
Sure.
time before.
That's right. So we're going to start tonight. I'm going to pass the mic to Kate Waterman. Kate has been a part of Quonnie for a number of years and lived in Central Beach. So great.
Thanks, Roy. I'm a little undone because Roy didn't tell me that I was supposed to have one memory. And I've had a hard time, I feel like a usurper, because how many people in this room actually grew up as summer visitors to Quonnie? I mean, right from the very beginning. See, that's a good smattering. That's a good smattering. I was an interloper. I came in 1950 as a girlfriend. And I walked into something that was extremely alien to me, and instead of talking about one experience, I wanted to talk just a little bit about what was a summer colony. I came from the South. I came from inland. I grew up on a little farm, and I had never been to a beach colony other than Atlantic City. Not quite the same thing. And it was a cultural experience. And I hope you don't misunderstand me when I quote Ann Rivers Siddons in her book, Colony. She referred to a summer colony as a tyranny of old women. Now, that sounds kind of harsh, and tyranny does, yes. But I want you to know that if you look back on the way things were, the gentlemen went back to work. They brought their families down, and they went back to work during the week. And the household and the community was run by Mama. And Mama had rules. And back in the 50s when I came which is when I started here. The rules are not the same. For one thing, there was the martini hour, and in those days, martinis were gin and vermouth, just barely. And that was a very important part of the day. They don't do martinis like that anymore, and they appalling things. But that was an important part of the day. The interesting thing about Quonnie then, at least as I experienced it in the Waterman house. Now those of you who don't know me, I'm talking about the house that is now owned by the Cotters. It was on the corner of Ninnegrit and Neptune. And the Watermans bought 4 lots back in the 20s, the late 20s, when the Thorpes were beginning to parcel it off. They offered one to my husband's grandparents right on the front row. And his grandmother said, no way was she going to go on the front row. She was going to stay back. Please. So it's actually on the highest corner there, across from the ball field. And they bought 4 lots, $300 a piece. Yee-ho. And put a house on double lots. And the house on the corner started first. Now this had 5 bedrooms, and it was always full. It was full of, well, when I came in, Dr. Waterman, Mrs. Waterman, her sister, that one's husband, Aunt Dorothy's husband, Aunt Nettie was Mother Waterman's aunt, and the bedrooms were full. It was a large family. But you were up for breakfast, and you sat around the table, and you had breakfast, and I had 3 children. If one wanted scrambled eggs, one wanted poached eggs. They each got what they wanted, and if one wanted pancakes, one wanted French toast, they each got that. Wow. This was food. I can't tell you how fabulous the food was. And then you, if you were lucky, you got to the beach in the morning, but you were back for lunch. And this was by the numbers. And looking back on it, it kept an order, and that was Siddon's point, was that there was a community structure and a culture that was very defined and held together by the women of the family. And it's fun to look at it that way, historically speaking. I don't know how it works now, because I haven't been a part of it for a while. And other than a peripheral part. I've only been out for 2 years, but that going back to the 50s, I mean, I'm a different person, the world is different, so I don't know what it's like anymore. I have a feeling it's a little more relaxed. I'm not sure that you have cocktail parties and are demanded to wear a dress. That was one of the things that drove us crazy, because my husband and I would come down for the weekend, and we're escaping to the beach. Mama Waterman's having a cocktail party, and you didn't bring a dress? No, never occurred. But we had wonderful times. Papa had a boat, we went sailing. I was supposed apparently to talk about the clam bake, which I bring that book every time we come together to show the family clam bake. The family, my husband's cousins are abound here, I think. How many husband's cousins are here? Randall's, come on, raise hands. Only 3? That doesn't seem right. But that's still good. There were lots of them, and they all came to the clam bakes. We had 15 or 20 people, and it was a fabulous treat. I will bring the notebook back again. I'm going to leave it in somebody's hands. I don't know whose.
I have copies of that.
You have a copy of it?
Yeah,
So
but not.
that's good. Good. But it was a large, tight family, and it was a great experience.
Thank you. Well, that's very good. And Phyllis Reynolds.
when I was asked by, and am I speaking too loud? I have a loud voice.
You're fine.
Okay. When I was asked by Ann to give a 5-minute presentation, I kind of laughed to myself. She doesn't remember me. I'm Phyllis Burdick Reynolds, with one L, named after a cow that came to the beach house of my grandmother on every morning to eat these leftover Johnny cakes. She jumped over the fence and broke her leg. And my grandfather at that time, this was probably in early 1920s, called the family doctor. And I found out since that my grandfather was the only one in a big area of East Beach that had a telephone. If you're wondering who my grandfather was, if you read the deeds on your houses, a lot of them will say something about H.H. and H.A. Burdick. That was my grandfather, my great uncle. And they bought and sold property, some of it that their parents before them had bought and sold probably 60 years earlier. I never lived in Quonnie until 1979. I lived on the Post Road, and my mother and father rented rooms during the Depression and put us kids up in the attic on mattresses or in a back room and rented the home out to, it was during the Depression, to people that came, and probably some of your ancestors came there and stayed overnight and ended up buying beach houses at Quonnie. I remember, it's hard for me to pick one particular memory, and I'm probably rambling because I'm 87 years old, and you're all going to be that old sometime, so you just have to be careful not to offend me. I was wondering if any of you were here in probably the early 30s when the summer people would come and help haul nets for my grandfather and Captain Ed Sisson. They had dories, both of them at different times. One owned the dory, and another time the other one owned the dory, because times were bad. It was just before the Depression. And they would fish and sometimes get a little hard up for money. They'd sell their equipment and do something else for a while. But they always were commercial fishermen up until probably 1940, my father and my grandfather. My dearest memories of Quonnie are probably listening to my grandfather tell about how I was related to Martha Crandall, who lived next door to us on the Post Road. She was his first cousin because his mother and her father were brother and sister. And then he'd go down to the next house and tell me how I was related to the people that lived in that house. And it got quite confusing, but it was a very small community in the 20s and previous to the 20s. There were very few of you there, I imagine, at that time. Getting back to my father fishing off the beach with a dory and a seine, I always kind of thought that he waited for the summer people to come before they did this, because it was always in the summer when the bluefish were biting. I guess that's, that was when they had set the nets. They needed the bluefish. But he'd have, as soon as he'd arrived down there with the boat, he and Captain Sisson, the summer people would be coming over to watch him. And before long, they were hauling the seine. And I kind of figured that was the season for bluefish, when the summer people were there to help them harvest the fish. I was also here during the '38 hurricane. And that was a very frightening time. We went to the beach the day after that storm. My father, of course, wanted to go and see how his father's home had made out there on Burdick Street, which still stands. And that was just a skew on the foundation. But his yard and the yards up beyond that, his barnyard, they found bodies of people. And they were found by the militia, and some of them were found earlier by local police and so forth, but most of them were found when the militia came. And they had prisoners they brought down to do the dirty work. And while they were there, they found a keg of wine that my grandfather had made in the barn. And mind you, my grandmother was the president of the WCTU before she came to Quonnie. And one day, my father went down there, and all the prisoners and the guards, some of the guards too, were laid out, passed out drunk. They found my grandfather's wine. He raised his own grapes. He had lived in Westerly previous to moving back to Quonnie. Oh, by the way, he had quite a successful business as a wallpaper and painter contractor. And when he sold his business, he sold it so he could come back to heaven. Burdick land, Quonnie, where all the Burdicks had lived for years and years and years. And he had moved away, moved to the city to make his showing. And he sold his house that he had built. It was quite a comfortable home on Pleasant Street in Westerly. And it had nice bathroom fixtures and all the works. And he sold it and bought this property at Quonnie. At the time, there were 66 acres, including plus 30 acres of woodlots that he purchased. And the purchase price, if any of you bought a piece of property in Quonnie in the past few years, the purchase price for the property was $2,560. That was, no, I'm sorry, I'm misquoting. That was when his father bought the same piece of property. The same piece of property was bought around, and I didn't look the date up, I should have, but probably around 1880, maybe later than that, or maybe earlier. I don't remember the exact date, but his father, Horace Burdick, and his brother, Hazard Augustus Burdick, owned that property before my grandfather ever bought it. That property went through bankruptcy 3 times before my grandfather purchased it. My grandfather and his brother. It ended up being just my grandfather's property. I don't know if I finished. Yeah, I did finish the story. My cousin Bob Thompson, which some of you may remember his grandmother, Lillian Jewett. She was quite a salty lady. She was my grandfather's sister. And when my grandfather's brother sold a property, it's a house that now is owned by Mrs. Zabel. He built that house, and when he sold the house, Aunt Hattie used to go over there just the same to pick all the berries that he'd raised and the raspberries and so forth. Family used to get upset with her and tell her, "You can't do that. Your brother doesn't own that property anymore." And she said, "Well, I'll pick them as long as I want. My brother planted them, and I'm going to pick them." And she did. You could plan on seeing her over there getting the raspberries. And I think they had quince. I don't know just what else they had. The finest memories I have of Quonnie was sleeping in the house that Grandpa and Grandma owned. And the wind always howled around that house, and you could hear it. And that's what I think of when I think of Quonnie, is the wind howling around that house. It was right on the pond site. I lived there until, well, from 79 until 99. And I had 20 years of walking on the beach every day before I went to work. And it was just a delightful experience. And I I envy all of you. Oh, I know it. It's the last thing I'm going to tell you. My Aunt Lucy and Aunt Mary, my grandfather's two daughters, and my father, when they found out that Dad wanted to sell their property in Westerly and move to Quonnie, they weren't one bit happy because they'd visited down there before and they knew what was there. And I imagine a lot of you find that hard to believe that three women, my grandmother and my two aunts, weren't just delighted to move to Quonnie, but they weren't. They came to a house that had no indoor accommodations. They had an outhouse, and they had left all those fine things in Westerly when they left there. And they also left the school, and my father ended up graduating from the 8th grade at the one-room schoolhouse that was in back of Brighton's store until probably 25 years ago when it was moved down to the Charlestown Library, Cross's Mills Library, where it sits today. So I'm going to pass this to somebody next door to me. This is Hope Green. She was my classmate, Hope Green. Now she's Hope Andrews.
Thank you, Phyllis.
I talked too long.
And Roy didn't tell me that I had 5 minutes or so. I'm the historian, so if I get talking, I'm a talker. If I get talking a little long, he can whip this away from me and carry it on, you know. It's all right with me. Okay, we all love Quonnie. Excuse my notes, but I'm going back a little bit in history, so I have to have the notes to tell you what some of the names. We all love Quonnie, don't we? She's loved for her weather, her recreation, her views, and her family memories. You can tell by the names of some of our cottages. Sea Spray, Ocean View, by the way. Mike Box, I see Holly is here. And our cottage was called At Last, still is. After a busy year, month, or a day, we would roll in at last into a little Eden on West Beach Road down toward the Breachway. But I love Quonnie especially for her rich history, her legends and her folklore, and that's what I wanted to mention to you, where you can still find it and look it up yourself. And of course, my family memories, my family's been here, not as long as Phyllis's has up on East Beach, but from the 1880s and 90s that they've been down here around the Breachway. But in my opinion, no one has surpassed Reverend Crispin Jones, the Franciscan monk, in capturing wonderful stories and anecdotes about Quonnie. He spent 6 years here in 1938 summering and attending an ill colleague, and he spent his free time roaming the beaches and talking to some of the old-time residents, recording their stories and anecdotes. And it's similar to what Anne and Charlotte are doing now, and that their work is going to be invaluable for years to come. They're carrying on. Well, Father Jones was described as being a big bearded Englishman who looked a little bit like the ruddy Friar Tuck. So we'll be forever grateful for his work. But one interesting story of his that I want to tell you, a conversation he had with Postmistress Hannah Green. Now, she was an old-time postmistress.
I know her.
Was she related to you?
Oh, probably.
Probably. I always loved Hannah Green's comment. She was a typical old Yankee.
She was.
And she told him that drunkenness, as we just learned from Phyllis, was very common in the late 1800s. And she got in the Quonnie area.
Oh.
And she
Must have been the summer people.
So she came to hate the sight and the smell of the liquor and so forth.
I'm right in front of you. I can't reach the floor with my feet.
Hannah Green related how the people would come and wait in a little post office for the mail at night. The mail came in a horse-drawn transport, so they were never sure what time it was going to come in. It was always unpredictable. So to amuse themselves, she let them use a little organ in her next room to play and have concerts by themselves. However, she didn't approve of their frequent excuses to go out to the barn to see a sick horse. And they always came back with obvious signs that they'd been liberally medicated themselves. But according to Reverend Crispin Jones, he wrote that Hannah Green died, well, I have the clipping. She died in October 1945 at the age of 87 years. She remembered the Great Hurricane of 1860. But she lived to see the evil of liquor completely eradicated in these parts. You'll find information in Quonnie's history and Cole's History of Washington and Kent Counties, 1889. They have quite a bit of that, which tells the historical story of Charlestown, the Stanton Sheffield House where we went to the library and so forth, Whistling Chimneys, which is a pretty special place, I think. And that's on West Beach and thought to be Joseph Stanton II's trading post. And as well as the Perry Burdick farmhouse around 1790, 1800, ancestors of Phyllis here. Another local historian that we don't want to forget is Margaret Rays. She wrote several articles in Tidings Magazine. Do any of you remember the Tidings Magazine? She wrote one here of I Remember Howard, a tribute on his 100th anniversary to Howard Thorpe. And if anyone wanted to look at it afterwards. And she also wrote a wonderful article about the Crapo family. Mrs. Crapo had a family of girls, and on Central Beach, this is another book if you want to look at it. I picked some of these up at the Westerly Library book sale they had this summer. I've saved most of my magazines myself, but I went in and they had a little pile of them, 25 cents each, and that's where I found this one of the Crapo family with their 6 cottages on Central Beach. Topsy, Hobby House, Cedar Haven, Come and Go, Treasure House, the Barnacle.
Barnacle and Come and Go are still there.
And Redwood. So I know when we built our cottage at last, I fell in love with Topsy because the siding on that siding light was like slab wood painted dark. And that's what I wanted on our cottage. And we had it the same way with Newport blue trimming. It's been all done over now, renovated and so forth when my grandson had an accident, so it's wheelchair accessible now and so forth. But these magazines are wonderful, and and Danny Ray's, her husband, did a wonderful talk on the Coast Guard House, and he has a lot of information on that. But those are good magazines if you can find them now. Another late, well-loved member that we've lost is Joan Bess Thompson, and she was related to this Crapo family. Mrs. Crapo was one of the people that was killed drowned in the 1938 hurricane. And she and Mrs. Crapo was an Arnold from Hopkinton. A lot of the people on West Beach in the early 1890s and so forth came from Hopkinton and started some of the hotels and so forth there. And so we shared the same great uncle. Novels that are written today have a lot of information, quite a bit of information about Quonnie if you read those. John Livesey's did several books, and the one he wrote on the 38th Great Hurricane of Quonnie hits everything right on the button. I think the main character in that was a 14-year-old boy just before the hurricane, who was about the same age as Phyllis and I think David was about the same age as we are. And it tells Quonnie and the Wesley area as it was, and he hit everything right on the button, his information and so forth. So those pre-war years that he wrote about were vivid and brought nostalgic memories back to me. Our legends that we have of Bunny Rock, Thomas Edison's iron experiment, and all, as well as the many hotels and the boardwalk and all that were brought back to life on Quantico Historical Society's trolley rides that we've had. So, and I have articles here if anyone wants to see them, of the Breakers Hotel, which was, well, it's here somewhere, that Donna got on eBay, and it tells about what the prices were and what they served and so forth. It's wonderful to look at. When we had the trolley rides, I'll just end my thing with one memory when on one of the trolley rides. My station was at West Beach, right down, well, you turn to go to the boat ramp. There's a corner there where the fishermen come in. Nothing there but rocks and sand, seagulls and so forth. And I sat down there on a rock one summer morning, the sun was out, and this fisherman, all by myself, waiting for the tour to come. This fisherman drove in, got out, took his rod off the car, and gave me a big smile, and he said, "Enjoying the summer weather?" And I said, "Yes." But actually, I said, "I'm sitting here waiting for a trolley." And I was very innocent, and he looked at me, took another long look, he took his pole and put it back on the car and got in the car. So when the trolley came in, I said, "Well, I saved you your parking spot."
We've got Central Beach, East Beach, and West Beach.
Right.
And here we have Ed Sayer.
Good evening. Now, some of you heard most of this last year, so I'll try to be brief. And the Sayer family, starting with my great-grandfather, came down here in 1903. And he and his son, my grandfather, built twin houses on East Beach, just toward Blue Shutters from Highland. It wasn't called Highland. It was a farm there. They bought their beach lots from Billings Macomber and built these twin houses with a porch surrounded them. Now, my grandfather and lived with us most of my, well, in fact, all of my boyhood life. And he and my grandmother had photos, and I heard these stories over and over again. So I can't tell you about the 1903 to 1921 period personally, but that's the period in which my father, who was Dr. Sayer, and his brother, and their mother, and as we've already heard, the men weren't down here most of the time, and they couldn't come weekends from Providence very well either, with coming by train and stage from Bradford, which was called Miami at the time. But they got down here sometimes, and I guess one of my grandmother's best friends was Lillian Jewett, who was a Burdick, and you've already heard some of her story. And they had more than one daughter, but the daughter Anne, who became a Thompson, Ann Thompson, and you might even know, some of you might have remembered her sons. Ann Thompson was about my father's age, and I have a stack of old postcards that were sent to my father. And there are postcards from Ann Jewett, there were postcards from Delphine Jewett, there are other postcards that are that I had no idea who they're from. Most of them were from relatives, though. Now, that period, my father and his brother, that's Ed and Ray Sayer, and their mother, they were down here all summer for a good part of 20 years. And those were wonderful years. I know from all the stories that I heard about that time. Now, my father's, I guess I didn't make it clear, but let's take it from my father's point of view. His father owned one of the twin cottages. His grandfather owned the other one. Now, his grandfather's household consisted of his father's two brothers, his sisters, rather. Those are, they would be, well, they were my great aunts, Ina Sayre and Louvain, who married Daniel Sewell later. And they built, I'm jumping ahead now, sometime in the 20s in Central Beach, on the inland side of Surfside, the third house from the bathing beach. That house is still there, but it hasn't been in the Sewell family for a long time. Their daughter Helen Patterson was there, however, in later years, which is still a long time ago. And I remember her three boys, Stephen, Thomas, and Kenneth. Now, back to my father's side of the family. He lived in Philadelphia with his parents through college, medical school. Then he had internships in various places, set up his own practice in Providence, first with his uncle, who was a doctor. And so during the 20s, his father had been forced to sell the house that had survived, barely survived the storms of 1912 and 13, I think they were. His grandfather's house was washed out to sea. So that's why the Sewells and Ina Sayre ended up in building in Central Beach somewhat later. Well, my father returned after he got married. He returned to Providence. As I said, he set up his practice. He was anxious to get back to Quonnie. And I can tell you that he was also anxious for his wife and children, which included me, to be able to enjoy being at Quonnie also. I don't know how he discovered Governor's Island, which is across from Grassy Point that you get at through Ninigret Park. But he was able to rent a little cottage on Governor's Island from Edward Wilcox Babcock of Troy, New York. Don't tell me he wasn't from Charleston with those names. In fact, his Governor's Island had been called Wilcox Hill at one time, like 200-300 years ago. Mr. Babcock was not about to sell ancestral land to a city slicker. But after he got older, and my father tried every year to buy it, in 1934 he was able to buy Governor's Island for this is 5 acres, surrounded, not quite surrounded by water. It was wet marsh toward the ocean side at that time, although apparently centuries ago it was totally surrounded by water. He was able to buy it for $150, and the very next year he had Harris Taylor build a nice house there in 1935. And that's about where my memory starts, because I was born in 31. So his wife and children, which included me, had wonderful summers there in 35, 6, 7, and 8. Now, since 38, there's no road up there. Since 82, there's no house there. It burned down. But my father bought a Ford Model A 1931 beach wagon, and we were able to go up the beach from time to time, but never to leave wife and children there all week or all summer. And during the wartime years, there were restrictions on getting up the beach anyhow, so he rented for us, for his wife and children, to stay at Waves Edge Cottage in Central Beach 2 summers, in 43 and 44. Became very good friends of Bill and Marion Holeen, who lived right behind us. And I remember the square dances, and we also danced the polka quite often too, as I recall. Then my father, I don't know whether he decided he really wasn't going to be able to resume ever getting back to Governor's Island. I know he tried going up to the town hall and seeing when the town was going to build a road up there, and as you know, they eventually built a short stub of a road that's still there, up from Blue Shutters a short distance, but never up toward Governor's Island. So he bought from Hazard H. Burdick, who he had known in his early years as a boy. Anyhow, I heard his stories about the Burdick brothers with their dories and seines and all this, but that's all hearsay to me. And so he bought land from the Dingle, which is now, what is it called? Bayberry, West Bay, South Bayberry?
Bayberry Lane.
Lane to East Pond. He bought, hung there, and he built it was a cinder block house he built, being hurricane conscious. And that house is still there. He called it the wilderness, and it truly was. You couldn't see a thing. It was all high bushes in there, and it still is. And but my mother and sister and I were able to summer there. When he came down weekends, got in the Model A Ford up to Governor's Island, though, because that was his special place that he had built 10 years before. Well, by 54, he sold it. I had been in the service. I was now married. My sister was in college. No more kids in the family. And so he sold that. He bought a new, in fact, I think he had to. I think the Model A Ford was drowned by Carol in Sewell's garage in Central Beach. I wasn't around that year. I was in the service, and I really can't tell you firsthand what happened. But he bought a new Jeep, four-wheel drive Jeep. He put a radio telephone in it, and he and my mother enjoyed the next about 12 years back at Governor's Island. Now you got to remember, they had propane up there to run gas lights and a range, kitchen range. They had a generator which required gasoline to pump water, so they had indoor plumbing since 1935. But there was no way for a Wakefield branch company to deliver propane up there, so he had to meet the propane truck at Blue Shutters, load it into the back of the beach wagon, and then the Jeep later, and he'd roll it up the lawn and install it himself. But he really loved Governor's Island, and he sold it the year he turned 65 to Bruce and Ann Glenn. And I found a clipping recently that shows David Godden had it up for sale several owners later in 1988 for $675,000 with no house on it. Now, my father had paid $150,000. I think that about might use my time up.
Thank you. Thank you.